taking them back to church.
I didn't get one.
That's Avery's in that change. Avery went back and changed.
We were.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
How are you? Everybody good? You feel as good as you look?
Yes.
Feel good? Y'all look good this morning. Good for speaking. Wasn't it though? Fall is creeping in on us, and these cooler mornings and low humidity is nice. Very much. Hope you picked up a bulletin. If not, get you one sometime today, and make yourself aware of everything's going on. There's a lot of important stuff in there, and I won't take our class time to read to you what you can read on your own, but there's a lot of things in there that to be aware of. No birthdays on the calendar today, but we've got Michelle is celebrating one Tuesday, right? On September the 12th. Now today is September the 10th, so tomorrow, when you get up tomorrow, and it's September the 11th, that's 9/11. Where's your mind gonna go? Where? See, her mind's going to a dark place. Don't let it go
verse that you tell us to remember.
Don't let it go there. Yeah, tomorrow is September the 11th is certainly a day of infamy in our history. And let's see, how many years ago was it? Now she says that. 22 years ago.
My children asked me, I said something about, yeah, I was there, you know, like, I remember it. That's why I said, it's real life.
Don't let your mind go to a dark place, okay? When you see September the 11th, I want you to remember 9/11 is Hebrews 9/11. How does that verse start? 3 words. But Christ came. So yes, it was a bad day on September the 11th, and we probably have bad days yet to experience, but it doesn't matter how bad the day gets, but Christ came. And that's how we live and we go on. So isn't that a great thing to think about? But Christ came. Okay, do we need to make some special announcements here before we get into our study today?
Remember that friend of mine, Elo, that's having her 3rd surgery, that has cancer. She's in her late 20s. They're supposed to be getting married next month. They had to move it a few months because she's got cancer. Yes. I just completely lost it. What kind of cancer? It is cervical. Cervical cancer. So this is her 3rd. It is. She's in there. It's tomorrow. Her name is Elo. We don't.
Hey, y'all, look, you're going to have to excuse me today, okay? I got just about to church this morning, and I told Tracy, I said, I forgot to put them here today. She said, turn around and go back in them. I said, no, I won't be late. So if I say, or if I have this blank look on my face when you're talking to me, just speak up. Just get a little bit louder. Oh, yeah, I've been wearing them a couple of months and love them. Now I feel lost without them.
Was supposed to be the Snyder family, whose baby died this week. He lived over 100 days. We have prayed for him in different groups. Baby Rachel's funeral is today.
Anything else that we have before we get into our study? Our study will continue the topic here that we introduced 2 or 3 weeks ago in this study of eschatology, which is the study of last things. And in particular, we're addressing things that might happen in the last days. But there is some confusion in the world about when that exactly is to occur, and that's what we're talking about. So We're in the 24th chapter of Matthew. I'm going to do my best to finish that today. And in the days to come, we'll visit the 9th chapter of Daniel. We'll visit a passage out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And maybe a passage or two in the Revelation. But there's several things that we could talk about. We'll try to keep it concise. But as we talk about this thought in the religious world about what are things happening in the last days. And as a matter of fact, what even introduced this study is questions that were submitted to me. Are the things that's happening in our world, or the current events, or the things that you hear on the news, are those things ushering in the end of time? Is this signs of the end of time? And so really what we're talking about is a study of eschatology. A lot of that comes from the 24th chapter of Matthew. So that's where we've been a couple of weeks. We'll try to finish that discussion up today. So if there's nothing further, John, open our class with prayer after you open that door. Wait, you might want to hold up. We got another couple coming in. Come in, yes, sir. Good to have you this morning.
Good morning. You said just
Send anywhere you want to, that's right. John, a word of prayer, please.
Father in heaven, we thank you for this day that you've given us. We thank you for the opportunity to come here to study thy word, worship you this morning. We thank you also for the seasons that are changing, and like was mentioned earlier, the beauty of your creation. When we wake up in the mornings and we have the cool mornings, it's just your majesty is all around us. We ask a special blessing this morning on the young lady who's having surgery again for cancer. We ask you to be with her and be with the ones who are taking care of her, help her to get back to her normal state of life, if it be thy will. We also ask that you would be with the family who lost their child this week, Father, and they're having a funeral today. That has to be one of the most difficult things a parent could go through. I ask you to just wrap your arms around that family and be with them. I ask you would go with us through our class this morning and through our worship service in the next hour. We thank you for your son Jesus, who died for our salvation, and we ask all these things in his name.
Amen. Appreciate that. Okay, let me put something up here that I've used before for us, but this is a representation of what we usually refer to as the doctrine of premillennialism. And I don't want to put this up here and I don't want you to have any misconception that this is what I believe. Okay, we're using this to talk about what a lot of the religious world does believe, though, that there's going to be a rapture. Well, I believe that. I believe there will be a rapture. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, I believe it's down in verse 13, says there will be a rapture. Those who are alive will be caught up together to be with the Lord. It's what happens after that I might have a problem with, because according to premillennialism, that rapture will usher in a 7-year period of tribulation. That really is what we've talked about in the book of in Matthew chapter 24. And then there will be a second coming of Christ. Well, I believe there's going to be a second coming of Christ too. Acts chapter 1. You know, as the disciples were there watching Jesus ascend, the angel said, he'll come again in the same way that you saw him leave. Jesus is coming again. But again, it's what happens after that. He's not coming the next time to set up a 1,000-year reign in the earthly kingdom and restoring the Jews to their physical nation of Israel, that 1,000-year reign. See, so there's parts of the thing, the doctrine that's kind of mixed in with with things that we find in the Bible. But our focus right now is on the idea of the tribulation. That's what we find in the 24th chapter of Matthew. So let's look there, and again, I'll try my best to get through this today and finish up. She saved you a seat over here. Just come right on in. Now, for the benefit of a few that's in our class here that wasn't with us before, let me just say the 24th chapter of Matthew is widely misunderstood. And a lot of it comes from the fact that you're not realizing what the context that it's in. Because remember back in the 3rd chapter of Matthew, we saw a reference being made to the axe is laid to the root of the tree. Trees, plural. The axe is laid to the root of the trees. Then we come on over to Matthew chapter 23, and in verse 38, Jesus makes reference to your house is left to you desolate. All of this is building toward what we find in Matthew chapter 24, which is a description of the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. So we got to have that as a background here as we enter into Matthew chapter 24. Now, the key to understanding Matthew 24 is to realize there's 2 questions to ask in verse 3. The disciples here said, tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? That's 2 questions. Now, the disciples at that time thought that it was one, because Jesus had just made reference to this massive temple would be destroyed. And the only thing the Jews could think about and the disciples could think was, that's got to be the end of time. This temple's going to last till the end of time. So when you're talking about the temple being destroyed, we're talking about the end of time. No, that's not the case. But their questions here, they ask 2 questions, and Jesus answers those 2 questions. Now, the first question they ask is, tell us when will these things be? When is going to be all this destruction, particularly of the temple? When is that going to happen? So he spends several verses here, all the way down through verse 34, dealing with that first question. Now, verse 30, all the way through 35, excuse me. Verse 36, we'll talk about that today. Verse 36, he addresses the second question. So the 2 questions that are asked, when's the temple going to be destroyed? When is all of that going to be torn down? When will these things be? The second question here is, and what's the sign of your second coming and the end of time? That's the second question. So if you were with us before, you know that I've divided the discussion here into 3 sections. He begins in verse 4 to talk about something that we call the remote signs. Then in verse 9, he begins something we call near signs. Remote signs is these signs that's out here, not close by. Then verse 9 begins signs that are close by. And then down in verse 15, he begins signs that we refer to as immediate. Those are immediate signs. So in verses 4 through 8, just call your attention here in the way of review to what's found in verse 6. Talking about in verse 5 that many will come in my name and say, I'm the Christ. And then verse 6 says you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Incidentally, that's a big part of the idea of premillennialism. They talk about wars and rumors of wars. It's not, we're talking about something that's happening here in the 1st century. He says, for all these things must come to pass, but mark this, but the end is not yet. We're talking about the end of the Jewish nation, the destruction of the temple. The end is not yet. Now go back to chapter 23 just real briefly. Look at verse 36 of chapter 23. Because here he says, assuredly I say to you, all these things, all of these woes that are pronounced throughout chapter 23, he said all of these things will come, what? What does it say? It says it's going to happen on this generation. This generation. This generation shall not pass before all of these things will happen. So, Verse 6 says, but the end is not yet. Go down to verse 8. Now, all of these things that he's talking about here are the beginnings. If I could paraphrase verse 8, I would say these are all the beginnings of the end. The end that he's talking about up there in verse 6. But that's not the end of time. That's the end of the nation of the Jews, okay? The Jewish nation. All right, verses 9 through 14, we won't spend any time there other than just to review. These are the near signs. The earlier ones, the wars, rumors of wars, people claiming to be the Christ, all of these things are signs that the end is coming. But then in verse 9, now let's get a little closer by. Nearer signs. Then they'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. Tribulation, that's the key. And you'll be hated by all nations for my sake. And then many will be offended. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, etc. But verse 13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And verse 14 says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then what will happen? Then the end will come. Not the end of time, the end of the temple there. That's the answer to the first question. Verse 15 begins what's called the immediate signs. Because here he says, flee. Once you see these signs, once you see the abomination of desolation here, that's from Daniel chapter 9. And we looked at Luke 21:20. What is Luke's account of the abomination of desolation? How does Luke phrase it? When you see what? The armies surrounding the city. And that's what's going to happen in AD 70. That's the Titus's army there surrounding the city. So very plainly in Luke's account, Luke's not directed to the Jews, Luke's directed to the Gentiles. So it wouldn't mean anything for Luke to say the abomination of desolation. The Gentiles wouldn't pick up on that. He got a little clearer to the Gentiles. That's the armies. But to the Jews, they would understand it very clearly because of what's written in Daniel chapter 9, and we'll get there. But the immediate signs here says, when you see these things happening, flee. Get out. Don't even go back into the house to pick up your coat. And he says, woe to them who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. We noted last time that that's just because travel will be harder for them. And pray that your flight be not in winter or on the Sabbath. Now remember, I told you to note the reference that's made to days in plural. You find that in verse 19, verse 22, and verse 29. Because we're talking about events and days, plural, of happening up before the destruction of Jerusalem there. So that's what we're dealing with here. Pray that your flight may be not in winter or on the Sabbath, same thing. So that brings us down to verse 21, and that's where we left off last week. For then there will be great tribulation. That's what we see up here on the screen. Tribulation. So when is that tribulation going to happen? We're talking about the context of the fall of Jerusalem here. Well, when did it happen? We know that from the study of history. When did that happen? It happened in AD 70. And Titus's army surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Now, the historical study behind that is interesting. We won't get into the details of it today, but there has been a little bit of uprising from the Jews and from those in Jerusalem. Rome didn't take kindly to any kind of uprising from anywhere. And so Titus was sent there to surround the city and to put down the uprising. Here's how it happened. It was about the spring of April or so of AD 70. And as a matter of fact, it was 3 days. This is interesting. It was 3 days after Passover. Now, what significance could that have been? think there'd be a few people in the city of Jerusalem in Passover? Oh, yeah. So it was right immediately after Passover of AD 70 that Titus surrounded the city and shut everything off. Nothing's coming in, nothing's going out. No food in, no water, no anything. And the city was overpopulated at that particular time. The siege lasted 5 months before the actual destruction of the temple. At the end of 5 months, in August or September of AD 70 is when Titus went in to destroy the city. But there's something real important happened in that 5 months. There was a little problem that we think is probably down in Egypt. And Titus withdrew the army and went to take care of the problem in Egypt and came back. But in that window of opportunity, what happened? What happened? Those people who were reading the signs and said, when there's an abomination of desolation, when the army surrounds the city, get out. So they looked for the opportunity, and they did. Josephus says that in the destruction of Jerusalem, there were 1.1 million Jews killed in that uprising. And supposedly not a single faithful Christian was killed because they could see the signs, and they got out. And they did what was said there in verses 18 and following here, 17 and following. They got out. So, now there's a key word here, a key phrase in verse 21 we need to note. It says, "For then there will be great tribulation." Talking about when this destruction starts, there's going to be great tribulation, such as has not been seen, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. Now the last phrase is what I want to note. Nor ever shall be. Now think about that. Jesus is saying when that time comes, there's going to be problems such as has never been seen since the beginning of the world, nor ever shall be. What does the nor ever shall be imply?
Today?
Well, the nor ever shall be implies that there's going to be a lot of time afterwards. That's not the end of time we're talking about. This destruction that happened in AD 70, Jesus said it's going to be bad. It's going to be worse than whatever happened from the beginning of time. And there won't ever be any time after that when it'll be this bad again. And unless those days, don't miss the plural part of days, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Now, verses 23 through 27. There's something said in verse 27 that causes a little problem sometimes. Verse 27 says, "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." Well, that's on the heels of verses 23 through 25, because Jesus said that during this time, people's going to come and say, well, here's Christ, or there's Christ. Verse 24 says, "False Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say, he is in the desert, do not go out. Look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it." What he's saying here is Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming for a second coming. He's coming back. And when he does, verse 27, it won't be a silent rapturing of faithful saints. Everybody's going to know it. Jerusalem says, the Revelation says that every knee will bow and every eye will see him and every tongue will confess. It won't be what we see sometimes here relative to the rapture, and that's all verse 27 is referring to. "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west," everybody's going to see it. That's what the second coming will be like. So during that time, when people say, well, Christ has come back, he's over here in the desert, or he's over here, don't believe it. Don't believe it. Verse 28, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. We're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that destruction here, Jerusalem here is actually referred to as the carcass. For where the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. The New King James Version refers to it as eagles. Eagles was a symbol of Rome, the Roman army. But I like another rendering even better. Who has something other than eagles?
Vultures.
The vultures. Yeah, there's several things. And I like that rendering even better than the eagles. But the eagles do make reference to the Roman army. It says, wherever the carcass, that's Jerusalem, is, there the eagles, there the vultures, there the Roman army will be gathered together. Now that leads us up to verse 29. Let me just skip ahead a little bit to verse 33. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, it's at the door. Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Everything that's written up to verse 34 is directed at that generation. It's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. But verses 29 through 31 cause people problems sometimes. How in the world can that fit into what we're talking about? Read it. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, plural, the sun will be darkened. Right after that tribulation that we've talked about here, the sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. You can underline that because we're going to talk about that. What does that mean? Of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. How in the world, Glenn, can you say that's not referring to the end of time? Verses 29 through 31 would appear to be referring to the end of time. How can that not be? I'm going to show you. Who's it written to? Who's Matthew written to? Jews. To the Jews. Remember we said 2 weeks ago that over 60 references to Old Testament passages are found in the book of Matthew, more than any other place. That's the reason we say that it's written, the target audience here are the Jews. They see, they understand, they read what's going on. So, hold your place there. Let me put a marker back. Hold your place in verse 20, chapter 24, verse 29, and let's go back to the book of Isaiah. You really need to mark some of these passages, because you'll forget what we're talking about today, and somebody will confront you with verses 29 through 31 and say that cannot be the destruction of Jerusalem, but it is. Go back to Isaiah chapter 13. Now Isaiah's prophecy here, chapter 13, begins verse 1 with this: the burden against Babylon. So Isaiah is going to talk about something here that is referring to the fall of a nation, the fall of the nation of Babylonia. Okay, the fall of Babylon. Go down to verse 10. Verse 10 says, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. What does that sound like? Does that sound like what we read about over in Matthew 24, 29 through 31? Go down to verse 13. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about the end of time? No, we're talking about the fall of the nation of Babylon. But the description of it here is using language that we find over in Matthew 24. I'm kind of dancing around something here. Some of the language we find, was that a bad choice of word? Some of the language that the Bible is written in is literal, and some of the language is figurative. And not being able to differentiate between the two causes a lot of problems. This is not literal language. We're not talking about the stars of heaven and their constellations will literally be darkened and not give their light. It's a figurative way of saying something is dying. And what is it in this case in chapter 13? It's the nation of Babylon. It's the fall of that nation. Now over in Matthew 24, what is it? What is it that's coming to an end there? The nation it's the city of Jerusalem and the nation of the Jews, the Jewish nation. All right, back in Isaiah 13 here, let's go down to verse 17. Just a quick note here. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. Now, if you remember Daniel chapter 2, what nation followed the Babylonians? What was in Daniel's dream, or Nebuchadnezzar's dream? What was the nation that followed Babylon? The Medes and Persians. It was followed by the Greeks. It was followed by the Romans. Those were the four nations. So here he's saying what's about to happen to the nation of Babylon. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. Go down to verse 19. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, let's leave there and go to chapter 19. Now, if you go back to Matthew 24, remember the phrase that I mentioned in verse 30. It says, "The Son of Man coming on the clouds." The Son of Man coming on the clouds really causes us to think that that would be the end of time. But look at chapter 19. Now, chapter 13, we had the burden against Babylon. Chapter 19, Isaiah's prophecy says the burden against Egypt. And look at the next phrase. It says, "Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud." See, that's part of that figurative language here. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. Now, if you want to mark in your Bible, put your cross-reference there to Matthew 24:30. That's the verse in Matthew 24. What?
I'm sorry, 19 verse what?
Verse 1. The burden against Egypt, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. All right? Hold on just a minute. Let me see where I'm going here.
Lynn, I'm still lost. Was that Matthew 19:1?
No, Isaiah 19.
Oh,
Isaiah 19:1, but it correlates to Matthew
Talking about the Lord rides on a
24:30. Let me find it. Okay, here we go. All right, we got Isaiah 13, we got Isaiah 19. Let's go to Isaiah 34. Then we'll go to Ezekiel. All of these here you ought to have marked in your margin there beside Matthew 24. Isaiah 34, if you look down to verse 5, you'll find who this is directed against. This is judgment, the fall of Edom in verse 5. But I want to go back up to verse 4 to begin reading. So Isaiah 34, verse 4, "All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as fruit falling from a fig tree." Does that sound familiar? Yes, that's just typical figurative language that's used. Verse 5 says, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on my people of my curse for judgment." Now, that's really all I wanted to cross-reference there, but I want to continue to read for this point here. Verse 6 says, "The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It's made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be filled or soaked with blood." Now, the reason I wanted to point that out again, in a figurative description of the fall of this nation here, he's talking about blood. And he makes the comment here about the land being soaked with blood. Now, if you want to cross-reference something here, you ought to cross-reference Revelation 14, verse 20. Because there's a description of the battle of Armageddon. And in the description of the battle of Armageddon, there's a reference here made that the blood is going to flow and be so deep that it'll come up to the nostrils of the horses. You remember reading that in Revelation? And I've had people tell me that's literally going to happen. In the end of time, Christ's second coming here, there'll be a battle in this valley called the Battle of Armageddon, that Revelation says the blood will be so deep that it'll come to the nostrils of the horses. That's a lot of blood. Okay, is that literal? Are we talking about something that's literally going to happen? No. Same thing that I just read right here. It's a figurative expression here in this description of the fall of Edom. All right, one more place I want to go is Ezekiel. All right, go to Ezekiel chapter 32. This may be overkill. If it is, y'all just, I get some privilege as being the teacher, okay? So I'm giving you enough that you gotta see my point. All right, so chapter 32 of Ezekiel, in verse 2, it says, "Son of man, take up a lamentation for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him." So in this particular prophecy, we're talking about the destruction that's coming on Egypt, the fall of Egypt. But let's go down to verse 6, and we'll see all of the same kind of references. "I will also water the land with the flow of your blood, even to the mountains, and the riverbeds will be full of you." Revelation 14:20. Cross references. Figurative, symbolic language. And verse 7 says, "When I put out your light, I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light." Enough of that. Let's go back to Matthew 24.
Revelation
14:20. All right, back in Matthew. Now again, at the risk of being redundant, to the Jew who's very familiar with Isaiah and Ezekiel and all of those prophecies and all of that figurative language there, when they read verse 29 through 31, what would they think? They would know. We're talking about the fall of a nation. Babylonia, Egypt, whatever the nation was, the Edom, all of those descriptions were given before, and so that's just the fall of Jerusalem out here. Now go down to verse 34 one more time. Everything that's been said up to that point. "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." That phrase, this generation and all these things, will not be used again now. He's addressed the first question. What's the second question? in verse 3, what was the second question?
What will be the sign?
What's the signs of
And then-
your coming and the end of the age or the end of time? What's the sign? Verse 36, all right, look, he used 30-something verses to answer that first question. But in the second question, answered in one verse. Verse 36 says, did it ring?
Yeah.
I told you I can't hear today. All right, so verse 36 says, but of that day, now emphasis on day, we're not talking about days anymore, change the topic. Verse 36 begins with the word but. Contrast with everything that's talked about up to that. But, want to answer the second question? But of that day and hour, what's the answer? No one knows. No one knows. Okay, so there's a lot more in Matthew 24 and 25. Maybe we'll make a quick reference to some of that next week. But where we're headed next week is Daniel chapter 9 and the 70 days. The 70 weeks, I'm sorry. The 70 weeks prophesied in Daniel chapter 9. That's what I remember here. Thank y'all for being here.